We have someone joining us all the way from the United States of America, Pennsylvania, to be precise, Dr. George Richards. Dr. George Richards is an associate professor in the Department of Criminal Justice, Anthropology, and Forensic Studies at the Edinboro University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Richards obtained his PhD in Public Administration and Urban Studies in 2004 and completed his MS in Justice Administration in the year 1994. He was a crime prevention specialist at Crime Prevention Institute, University of Louisville from 1992 to 1995. In the year 2002, he became a certified prevention specialist for Ohio Crime Prevention Association. Dr. Richards has served as a president of Ohio Council of Criminal Justice Education for 2 terms in the year 2006 and 2009, respectively. Dr. Richards authored a book, Crime Prevention Praxis, published by Cognella Academic Publishing, San Diego, in the year 2019. He has made contribution as an author in different book chapters, encyclopedia articles, monographs, and several journal articles as well. He is a manuscript reviewer for Buttersworth Pierson Prentice Hall Incorporation and Roxbury Publication Company. Dr. Richards is an acknowledged member of Northeastern Association of Criminal Justice Sciences, American Society for Industrial Security, Criminologists Without Borders, Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, and Southern Criminal Justice Association. Dr. Richards is honored with several awards like Outstanding Mentor by Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, Outstanding Mentor by Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, and Educator of the Year, Edinboro University of Pennsylvania, Alpha Phi Sigma Award for Outstanding Faculty, Indiana University, Kokomo, and Southern Criminal Justice Association Graduate Student of the Year. With a very enthusiastic audience, we welcome now Professor George Richards. Sir, you're very much welcome.
I hope this finds you well. It sounds somewhat odd to say, coming to you from 8,000 miles away and electronically, but it is always good to come home again. I have always felt very much at home with the visits I've made to Symbiosis in Hyderabad and working with the very good people there, whom I miss terribly. I was hoping to come this summer, obviously due to COVID travel restrictions. That was not possible. It probably will not be possible for the same reason in the summer of 21, but it is my hope that in the not too distant future, I will be able to come again and work with a very fine faculty and staff, administration, and students at that institution. Good morning, and your thoughtfulness in including me in this, I think, very worthy training session it honors me greatly. Each day a child leaves for school, and they go to school with much more than the backpacks on their back with their books and papers and notes and what have you. They go to school with a collection of their experiences that they had the day and night before at their home and in their community and their neighborhood and through the interactions with their families. So when a child walks into the classroom, they are not only sitting there pulling out their books, they're pulling out all their experiences. And in order to serve a child, we need to understand this. I want to say before I go any farther here that I'm going to be using I'll be referring to statistics and research throughout my presentation. Please know that all of this is from the U.S. perspective, and that is solely what I have experience and expertise in. Putting it all together, you have to put the puzzle of child abuse, and it is a puzzle. Trying to figure out where the pieces come. Is it primary? Is it secondary? Is the child the primary victim, or is the child witnessed the abuse, impacted by the abuse, the secondary victim? You try to put all these things together in order to best serve the child's needs. And trying to come up with a very holistic approach and perspective to do this becomes challenging. When you start dealing with a child victim, you have to bring so many players into account. Who witnesses the abuse? Who reports the abuse? Who are the witnesses to the abuse? You have teachers, you have health professionals, you have first responders, generally the police, you have social workers, you have foster families, the list goes on and on. All of these people are players in this scheme. And one of the things that is paramount, and we are starting to do a little better job of in the United States, and I think a lot better job of in the last 20 years or so, I think, is to get these players to come together in a more cooperative fashion. Gender issues, what we know is this: girls, by just a slight percentage, experience more overall abuse than boys, but we could pretty much call it half and half, 50% each. More boys will die, though, as a result of child maltreatment than girls. Girls are 2 to 3 times more likely to be sexually abused, and more men report experiencing violent behavior from adults as children. Okay. The third blurb there, be very careful here. This is what is reported, girls being 2 to 3 times more likely to be sexually abused. When I teach research methodology, one of the things I always caution my students about is to be careful between what we suspect to what we know. We may suspect a great deal, but unless we can quantify it, unless we can research it and discern it, it becomes quite difficult to be able to put down on paper as something we actually know. I suspect that the number of boys being sexually abused is significantly higher than reported. And this is for a variety of reasons. Machismo might be one of them. Embarrassment is certainly another. Although that's going to be a factor in all instances of sexual assault. But I strongly suspect that the frequency of sexual assault among boys as children, adolescents, is much higher than reported. When professionals start dealing with gender issues when it comes to child abuse and working with them, there are certain attitudes and certain experiences. What do we expect? Well, should boys cry? A lot of times they do not think it's acceptable for them to cry. That's a way to suppress their emotions. Is abuse suspected equally for boys as it is for girls? If you go into a home and you see one child, you see 2 children under the age of 10, one is a boy, one is a girl. The girl has been sexually assaulted. Are you going to suspect the boy has as well? And there is a very good chance that he has been. Do you encourage boys and girls equally to discuss how they feel and their attitudes towards certain things, certain beliefs, certain relationship attitudes, how they feel about their father, their mother, or someone that they interact closely with in the community? Do you teach boys how to express their emotions and how to tell if they are being mistreated? This is not only for boys, but should also be there for girls as well. But I think for males, especially male adolescents, this becomes more problematic, at least in the U.S., to get them to open up about how they feel. And you teach boys as well as girls about good touches and bad touches. If someone hugs a child, is that appropriate? Or when does a touch become inappropriate? And if they believe it is inappropriate, who do they tell and how do they express it when they do tell? Perpetrators. More women than men abuse children. This comes out of victim reports. It is slightly larger than men. Men and women use physical violence about equally. Be careful here. That depends on who's collecting the data, and it depends upon how people qualify physical violence. Is this beating a child? Is it smacking a child? Is it punching a child? Is it spanking a child? Is it whipping a child? There are a lot of folks who would not believe spanking is physical violence. Other folks believe it is. Males are more likely to perpetrate sexual assault. We believe that about 25% of sexual abuse is committed by women. But know that these statistics are limited, and there's a lot of factors that go into play here, non-reporting being probably the most significant. Males at risk for child maltreatment are less able to take the child's perspective for when seeing behavior. If they were mistreated as a child, probably they are not going to, they will consider that to be normal, and that normalcy will come into play and cloud their worldview. And women at high risk show more personal distress when confronted with issues of perpetration of child abuse. The younger the child, the more likely they are to be abused. They are more vulnerable, they are less capable of physically fighting back or running away, and are less able to communicate what is happening to them. And they are, even if they understand what it is and can use some verbiage, they cannot adequately express it. And children are affected differently by child maltreatment at different stages of their development. At a younger age, a child may think that they were, once they get the initial notions of what guilt is, they may feel that they are guilty of some type of act and that they are being punished. And what is happening to them is because they are a quote unquote bad person or a bad boy or a bad girl. We know this is certainly not the case, but that's how a child will perceive it. Children with special needs. Children with disabilities, they're 1.6 times more likely to be physically abused, 2.2 times more likely to be sexually abused, and nearly 2 times more likely to be neglected. And they're more likely to be maltreated by a family member, and that goes with all forms of child abuse. You're obviously someone within the home is going to spend the most amount of time with the child. There's going to be the privacy of the home, and it is going to be probably a great way to phrase this, an ideal spot. If you're going to abuse someone, you do it within the privacy and sanctity of the home. A lot of times when we focus on child abuse, we think about physical abuse, we think about sexual abuse. And obviously I'm not negating either one of these. It's horrible, either one, but there are others to go along with that. 2 others in particular. One would be emotional abuse, is when you berate the child, when you bully the child, when you intimidate or insult the child constantly. It certainly has an impact on their self-esteem. The other one is neglect. When the child is not adequately cared for, they adequately fed or clothed, is their hygiene seen to? Basic neglect. And these 4 are oftentimes work in tandem. If you see one, you'll see all 4. You just may see one of the 4. You can't take it for granted that they will all work together or won't work together. A thorough investigation of the entire situation needs to be made. There are relationships between special needs. Hello? A disability puts a child at increased risk for maltreatment. The disability may have been caused by maltreatment. The child could have been hurt by someone mistreating them. They could have had a broken bone. They could have had a head injury, etc. There are certain factors that will increase the likelihood of having a disability and also increase the chance of maltreatment. The 2 are children born to addicted parents and a child born in very severe poverty. 4 out of 5 children from violent homes have witnessed extreme violence, generally perpetrated in the parental relationship. Generally speaking, it's going to be perpetrated male against female. 3 to 5 children in each classroom may be witnessing violence in their own homes. And you're talking roughly about a classroom averaging 20 students, give or take. Violent relationships begin when teens are about 15. That's when you will have more, the relationships become somewhat serious, and you are going to see interactions. And what people will do is simply emulate what they have seen at home and what they believe is acceptable behavior because it's what they've witnessed their entire lives. So if you see a young boy or a young girl in their mid-teens and they are dating, you cannot take it for granted that violence is not occurring there simply because they are young. That may not be the case at all. And if they are underage, it certainly becomes abuse. Children who witness violence or abuse within the home are secondary victims. They do not suffer it per se, but they do suffer the effect of abuse because of the many different, many faceted problems it can cause. Esteem issues, fear, anxiety, and it's very much akin to being an actual victim. Child care providers, first responders need to be trained to recognize secondary victims. How do you tell if a kid is a secondary victim? Or how do you tell if someone is a victim? One of the things I encourage my students to be is to be a people watcher. Go out in public. Don't do this, obviously, but sit on a bench, watch people walk by, and try to observe them and try to get a feel for who they are, what they do, and how they feel and how they project themselves. Does the person make eye contact with you? Are they nervous? Do they fidget? Are they constantly playing with their hands? Some of these are telltale signs. The person is anxious for a reason. All of these things, any of these things alone may mean nothing, but put them all together or a multitude of these variables, it could very well mean that they are victims of abuse. The younger the child, the more vulnerable they are to damage because of the uncontrollable, terrifying experiences may have their most profound effect when the central nervous systems and cognitive functions have not fully matured. What you're talking about is something that will stunt the learning process and the learning curve and will lead to a future permanent impairment. Chronicity. This is going to be a word that is bandied about in the literature quite a bit. It simply means the more chronic the abuse, the greater the impact. You're talking about severity. You're talking about severity generally over a period of time. The child believes that it is more vulnerable and it is helpless. As a result, it will become problematic later in life. They will have a difficulty with problem solving. They will also have significant difficulties in building trust with people, and a variety of other factors. The severe physical abuse can cause physical impairments, developmental delays, and brain damage. Neglect can cause failure to thrive. Relationship to the offender. The closer the relationship between the offender and the victim, the greater the resultant trauma. I never really understood how neglect could impact someone until, I don't know, say 15 years ago. I was working with a colleague, great man, has since retired. And Charles was about 5 feet 5 inches tall. He was a shorter man. And we were talking one day, and he pulled out an album of pictures of his family. And I looked at both of his parents, and his father was a very tall man, about 6'5". His mother was tall as well. She's about 6 foot. And he said, "Can you figure out why I am the size I am, considering I had such tall parents?" And he went on to share, he goes, I simply did not have enough food. Growing up, I did not have enough protein because we simply did not have the money to buy it. So the failure to thrive, the failure to grow, neglect can do this. Now, in the case of Charles's parents, poverty was not their fault. It was simply a circumstance when they found themselves, but it did have an impact on him, and it can impact others in the same way. The level of threats, the use of threats, including nonverbal threats, can produce fear and generalized anxiety in victims of child abuse. Children do not understand that threats may be empty or that the person giving the threats cannot follow through on them. The sex of the victim, male victims show long-range serious problems and greater psychopathology. They are more likely to be abusers if they were abused as a child. Other mediators and effects of child abuse, and I'm going to go through this a little quickly because I'm not quite sure how much time I've got left, but the emotional climate of the child's family. Is the abuse intergenerational? Does it go from one generation to the other? And more often than not, it does. Does the parent have inappropriate or skills that lack? They don't know simply how to raise a kid. They don't have support systems. Socially, they are incompetent. They do not have adequate social skills to interact with others. And I'm talking about the child's family, the leaders of that family. Factors of emotional distress, high expectations of the child or inaccurate perceptions of the child, what the child should be expected to do, and they are incohesive and inflexible in dealing with the child. The child's mental and emotional health. If the child's overall health is good prior to suffering abuse, they have a better chance of resisting the damaging long-term effects. Will certainly impact them short-term, but they have a better chance. It's not a guarantee, but they'll have a better chance to resist it long-term. Level of cognitive development. The higher the level of cognitive development, the better protected they are psychologically. So the older the child is, the more likely they are to be able to withstand abuse. The guilt the child feels, the more guilt the child abuse victim feels, the greater the impact of the abuse. Why? Because they internalize it. They feel like they are the bad person. They feel like they are the perpetrator. They caused this. They deserve what they are getting. And if I have heard one victim of child abuse say this, I've heard 100 say, I always believed it was my fault. And even though they may very well be an adult and see things through the eyes of an adult and rationalize things as an adult, they still feel the way they did at times when they were a child. Parental responses to the child's victimization. If the parent is either unsupportive or overreacts, it can result in greater trauma. If the child goes to a parent, reports something's going on, the parent doesn't believe them, the child is apt not to go back and report it a second time because it was extremely embarrassing to go forward the first time to report it. Dynamics of abuse and neglect differ in regards to parental attention. Abuse results in the victim receiving attention from the parents and caregiver, even if the attention is harsh and damaging. Neglect results in the victim receiving no attention at all from the parents or caregivers. If you have someone you have a parent that is abusing a child physically, they are at least addressing the child. Please do not misunderstand me here. It is not acceptable whatsoever. But for that instant, they are paying attention to that child, although extremely inappropriately. Neglect means that the child is not even in their thoughts. And these both will impact the child in different ways, and both quite negatively. Symptomatic behaviors, sexual abuse, fear, anxiety, depression, anger and hostility, difficulties in school, paying attention, grades will drop, running away, or various forms of delinquency where they are acting out, or inappropriate sexualized behavior. They may try to, children who suffer sexual abuse, may try to experiment sexually at a much younger age than is thought appropriate. Neglect. You find deprivation and attachment, repression of feelings, developmental delays, impaired ability to empathize with. You lash out violently. You're more prone to engage in delinquency, inappropriate behavior, a variety of sorts. A decrease in general intellectual ability due to the lack of cognitive stimulation. And you simply don't interact with outside of school. Even in school, maybe if you're a neglected child, school may be a very haphazard thing when you attend it. And if you're not attending school and you're within the home, then you do not interact with parents, neighborhood children, or other people in your community. Emotional abuse, feelings of being unloved and unwanted, anxiety, aggression, hostility, anxious attachment to parents, self-destructive behavior, oftentimes cutting. Oftentimes cutting is a part of this. Tendency to act as a caretaker to parents, fear or distrust, a negative view of the world, and feelings of inferiority and withdrawal. Physical abuse, a lot of the same things here. I'm just going to talk about a few that we have not addressed. You withdraw from life. You are very compulsive, might be. You cannot enjoy life like others could who did not suffer this type of abuse. You're very defensive constantly, paranoid, bordering, and may very well be paranoid. You have learned helplessness. You simply believe that you cannot defend yourself and you're quite helpless going through life. And you're always worried about the behavior of others. Why? Because you are being defensive. When counseling victims of child abuse and neglect, clinicians should provide opportunities for self-exploration, adaptation, and how they can, and new functional behaviors. And we should resist the urge to over-gratify or overstimulate the child, and over-attention and compliment should be curtailed. When you deal with the child, you deal with the child as simply and as honestly as you can. You do not try to make more out of the situation or less. You deal with it honestly. Response received by disclosure is linked to those levels of self-esteem and functioning as adults. What we know is that what influences as children is certainly going to impact how we interact as adults and what will shape our worldview as adults. What is important is that we take action to stop the abuse or to address it. And you have to elicit support from the non-offending family member to support the child and to break the cycle of violence. And you have to help kids resolve the internal conflicts of being victims so they won't look at themselves for the rest of their life as being a victim. When you go and take a child into treatment, you have to decrease and eliminate the responsibility the child has for the neglect and for the abuse. You have to decrease their isolation, draw them out, engage them. Not only with you, but oftentimes a child will not be engaging with peers. So you try to get the child to engage with others. Teach them how to express themselves verbally. You try to do something that will increase their self-worth and self-esteem. Try to find what the child has a natural talent for. Engage them in that. Let them feel good about what they can do and what they have to offer. And help them develop coping skills when something happens, regardless of what it is, that they are able to better cope with it. You can do this by certain techniques they can have for relaxation, certain Who do they go to talk with if they have a problem? Who do they report victimization to? These are all coping skills. 4 phases of therapy. There's the intake, there's the beginning phase, the middle or processing phase, and the last is the termination phase. Intake phase, we determine the child's need for therapy based on symptoms of abuse. We learn as much as possible about the problems and how severe they are. We take a history of the child and develop a treatment plan. And this is where a good social worker, a good child psychologist is absolutely essential. I have been teaching now for over 25 years, and I have literally taught and trained thousands of police officers. And I've stayed in touch with many of them. And oftentimes I'll talk with them about, what's the toughest part of their job. And without fail, they will all say one of the most difficult things they have to deal with is when they interview children about abuse they have suffered, simply because they cannot get the child. It becomes very, very difficult to get the child to express what happened to them for a variety of factors. They simply do not have the experience. They simply do not know the correct words, terminology, the verbiage, or their embarrassment. It is essential that first responders, police, teachers, etc., be able to identify abuse, take the child out of the situation, if at all possible, but then put the child into the hands of someone that can assess this as soon as they can. Beginning phase, you want to establish trust and rapport with the child. And how do you do this? You simply do it by being genuinely interested in the child and not promising more than you can deliver upon. Because if you do that and cannot deliver, it's going to destroy any trust you had with the child. You try to find out what the child is interested in and what they need, and you try to work on that and provide it. It helps if a therapist is somewhat knowledgeable about what kids are knowledgeable of. What music, movies, activities of various age groups. You can relate to them somewhat doing that. Don't depend too much on this, though. It helps certainly to do this, but if you try to pretend you're something you are not, that's going to come across as very false, and it's going to reduce trust. So knowing something about it is one thing. Trying to pretend you are a child or being too awfully familiar with it is quite another. In the middle phase, we're still working with the child. We try to identify how the child has been affected by the abuse, identify ways to cope productively with their symptoms, and address and explore memories, sensations, thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. And the termination phase, this is when therapy is wrapped up. And this is when the child may be back in the home by this time. The child may be in foster care. The termination phase is when the child is able to take what they have learned in therapy and be able to use it in creating a new life for themselves, in that they have the skills now to cope and to understand that what happened to them is genuinely not their fault. And they can take the skills that they found in therapy and use them in other areas of their life. And the child in this termination phase may show some degree of ambivalence, and if they do, that is going to be somewhat expected. Treatment modalities. How do we get children to engage? Play therapy. What kind of games do they like to play? How can they express themselves through playing games? Art therapy. I've got several students now who have gone into social work and have become art therapists. It's really quite fascinating what they can do and how they can get especially smaller children to explain the circumstances of their life, at least perceived, through the pictures they draw. Journaling is for folks that are going to be a little older, probably late childhood, adolescence, but they write down in a journal what they feel, what they see each day. Individual therapy, one with a counselor. Group therapy is when you find a group of peers and you sit around and discuss what is going on And both of these are useful for group therapy. It helps in that children and those undergoing therapy, it doesn't matter what age group, they believe, they see that they are not alone, that others are dealing with the same problems they are. And lastly, the family therapy. The entire family goes in to see what problem is endemic at the core of the family. Certain references I've taken here, I can provide these. I can provide this PowerPoint with it to anybody that wants it. Just shoot me an email at Endinboro, and I'll be more than happy to send this to you. And these are some resources that I have found. Publications here are good, peer-reviewed journal articles, Journal of Child Sexual Abuse, Child Maltreatment, Child Abuse and Neglect, the Advisory Board on Child Abuse and Neglect, and the Child Abuse Hotline here in the U.S., which is 800-96-ABUSE, but they also have a website as well. And that concludes this presentation. At this time, I will take any questions from the audience participants.
Thank you so much, sir, for the insightful talk. We have a few questions from the attendees. Hamruta, can you please put forward the questions?
Greetings, sir. I'll be presenting the questions raised by the participants from the Google form provided, followed by the questions from the chat box. Sir, who are considered as the first responders? Do they need to be qualified in a particular profession?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Who are considered as first responders? Do they need to be qualified in a particular profession?
It's a good question. It's going to depend on the training. Qualified as far as degrees, a certain degree certainly is going to help. First responders in this situation are probably going to be police if they are going to be called in for a criminal report. It is certainly going to help if police are trained in how to discern signs of child abuse. All right, one of the things, this is an example here that I use in class a lot. Okay, I have a son. He is 22 now. But when he was a little bitty boy, he was all the time falling, running into things, scraping his knees, his elbows, all the time. This kid had bruises and scrapes all over his hands and knees. Is this natural for a kid to suffer those type of injuries? Yeah, absolutely. If you see a child, though, with bruises and welts on their torso, no, it is not. So having a certain amount of training in what to look for is going to be absolutely essential for first responders. Now, probably it's more appropriate for a teacher to have that type of training, because they're going to be the ones that are going to be interacting with children much more than an officer will if there's no report ever taken. So yeah, I think training is essential here for first responders.
Sir, I have one more question. Does the age of the victim matter when it comes to mental health? I mean, a child of 2 or 3 years of age who is facing abuse, does it equally, the mental health, is it equally affected when compared to a child who is put through the abuse when he or she is at the age of 9 or 10?
The abuse is certainly going to impact them. It's going to impact them differently in how they express it. If the child suffers abuse at the age of 2 or 3, it's going to be more raw. It's not going to be as easily processed. That is more apt to be seen if it happens at that earliest stage in life and it continues throughout their childhood. It's going to be seen as a natural consequence. If the abuse starts later in childhood, say around the age of 9 or 10, then it is going to be much more abrupt, and as such will have more of an impact as to how they conduct themselves. they're going to become more withdrawn. They're going to become more shy. They're going to become more anxious and nervous. And they are going to act very much like they could almost have the symptoms of someone with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, someone going through that. It's certainly going to impact, but it will impact much different.
Sir, I have one more question.
Please.
How should the family deal with the child victim having mental health issues because of the abuse?
I want to make sure I understood that. Repeat that one more time, please.
How should the family be dealing with the child victim having mental health issues because of the abuse?
Okay. First of all, you need to deal with it, and hopefully the stigma is changing. I think it is changing globally. The stigma against mental health issues in general. Mental health issues should be treated like any other type of health concern. It is simply one of those things that happens. It's an ailment, and we do what we can to get beyond and get past it. The family needs to absolutely be supportive of the child, not to negate what the child is going through, not to overreact to it. If the child needs treatment, and they no doubt will need some type of treatment, to see that the child gets it, support the child through it, and to see that the child uses those coping skills learned in treatment in order to deal with it in the future and other things that come up. And to not, one of the things you try to overcome, and I heard the father of an abused girl talk about this once. He said, I could not allow my daughter to spend the rest of her life looking at herself like she was a victim. So you try to teach children the coping skills to not become a victim and to be stronger. And yes, that's how I would say the family needs to be an integral part of the treatment process. But they need to be led by a professional.
Sir, I have one more question.
Please.
How much of an impact have the CPS case workers made, and is it resulting in a decline of number of cases?
I cannot speak to, like I said at the outset, all I can speak to is the American perspective. Here in the United States, as we have had more child abuse, specialized units in policing dealing with child protection, and we've had greater training done in teaching K through, especially kindergarten through elementary school, we've certainly seen a reduction in numbers of these cases, and the severity and impact of these cases.